why you feel older than everyone your age, the psychology of souls that matured too soon. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. You can rest for 8 hours and still wake up carrying it. It sits behind your eyes and underneath your ribs, and it has been there so long you've stopped noticing it as separate from you. You call it personality. You call it being mature for your age. But if you have ever sat in a room full of people your own age and felt like you were watching them from behind glass, like they were speaking a language you used to know but somehow forgot, then what you are feeling is not personality. It is history. Somewhere along the way, you stopped being the age on your birth certificate, not because you wanted to grow up faster, because something around you required it, and nobody asked whether you were ready. This video is not about the compliment people give you when they say you seem so much older than you are. That compliment, kind as it sounds, is often a diagnosis wearing a disguise. What we are going to unpack today is the real psychological architecture behind premature maturity, how it forms, what it costs, why it makes you feel permanently out of step with your peers, and why the tiredness you carry is not weakness. It is evidence of a nervous system that had to grow up before it had the resources to do so safely. By the end of this video, you will understand why you have always felt like the oldest person in every room, even when you were the youngest one in it. And more importantly, you will understand what it actually takes to let yourself be your age again, even now. Maybe you already sense this about yourself, even if you have never had the language for it. You are the one who remembers everyone's birthday and no one remembers to ask about yours. You are the one who reads a room before you have even taken your coat off, calculating who needs what before anyone speaks a word. You have been told, more times than you can count, that you are wise, grounded, an old soul. And each time, some small, tired part of you wanted to ask a question nobody seemed prepared to answer honestly. Wise compared to what? Grounded because of what? What exactly did it cost to become this steady? This is not a video about pathologizing depth or turning a compliment into a wound for the sake of drama. Depth is real, and it is yours to keep. But depth that was built too early, under pressure, in rooms that were not designed for a child's nervous system, behaves differently than depth that grew at its own pace. It carries a residue, a low hum of fatigue underneath even your best days, a sense of watching your own life slightly from the outside, and a persistent, quiet feeling that everyone else got to keep something you had to give up early. Let's begin where it usually starts. Not with a single event, but with a role. When childhood ends too soon. Every child is born with a job description, whether they know it or not. The job is simple. Be a child. Be curious. Be irresponsible in small ways. Be allowed to fall apart over things that do not matter, and trust that somewhere close by, an adult is holding the parts of life that are too heavy for small hands. For some children, that job description gets rewritten early, and usually quietly. Maybe a parent was sick or drowning in their own emotional chaos. Maybe money was a constant, low-grade emergency. Maybe there was a sibling who needed more than the household had to give, and you became the one who filled the gap nobody else could fill. Psychologists call this parentification, and it does not always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it looks like being the responsible one. Sometimes it looks like being the peacekeeper, the therapist for a parent's marriage, the emotional thermostat of an entire household. Here's the part almost nobody explains to you. A child's brain does not process this reassignment as an event. It processes it as a fact about the world. This is simply what a child is for. And once that belief settles into the architecture of a developing mind, it does not politely leave when the circumstances change. It becomes the operating system underneath everything else. You did not decide to grow up fast. You adapted to a world that could not hold you as a child, so you learned to hold yourself, and often to hold others, instead. Parentification researchers describe two versions of this. Instrumental parentification, where a child takes on practical tasks beyond their years, like managing money, cooking meals, translating for a parent, raising a younger sibling in every way but name. And emotional parentification, which is quieter and often more corrosive, where a child becomes the confidant, the mediator, the one who absorbs a parent's anxiety or sadness or anger so that the adult in the room does not have to hold it alone. Many people who feel older than their years carry both, layered on top of each other, so seamlessly that they never had a moment to notice the handoff happening. What makes this especially difficult to see later in life is that it so rarely announces itself as harm. Nobody sat you down and said, "From now on, you will be responsible for things a child should never have to manage." It arrived gradually, through 1,000 small cues. A sigh of relief when you handled something without being asked. A parent's praise reserved specifically for the moments you acted like an adult. You learned correctly that being useful earned you a kind of safety and approval that simply being a child never did. So you kept being useful. Long after the specific crisis that started, it had faded into the background of your life. That single adaptation, repeated day after day during the years your brain was still being built, is the seed of almost everything we are about to explore. The room where you grew up fast. Picture a specific kind of room. It might be a kitchen table where the mail was never opened. It might be a hallway outside a bedroom door where a parent's voice was too loud or too silent for too long. It might be nothing more dramatic than an empty apartment after school, a note on the counter, a silence that taught you to keep yourself company because no one else was coming. In that room, something in you calculated the odds and made a decision faster than conscious thought could ever move. If I stay small and need things, this situation gets worse. If I get bigger than my age, this situation becomes survivable. That calculation was not weakness. It was a form of genius. A child's nervous system, faced with an environment that cannot meet its needs, does not collapse. It reorganizes. It grows a kind of premature competence that lets it function in a world built for adults. The tragedy is not that you adapted. Adapting kept you safe. The tragedy is that the adaptation never got an expiration date. Most people assume maturity is something you earn by living long enough. But for you, maturity was not earned. It was requisitioned. It was taken from a future version of you and installed early, without your consent because the present moment required it. And the version of you that had to grow up in that room is still, in many ways, running the show today. Think about what happens in the brain of a child who repeatedly faces a situation too big to control. Since the situation cannot be changed from the outside, the child changes on the inside instead. Perception sharpens. Emotional reactions get filed away for later, because there was no space to have them when they occurred. A kind of internal adult gets constructed early, cobbled together out of necessity, whose entire job is to keep the household or the parent or the piece functioning. This internal adult is often remarkably competent. It gets you through years no child should have had to navigate alone. But competence built this way rarely knows how to stand down once the danger has passed, because it was never given an end date, only an assignment. This is part of why so many people who matured early describe feeling like they skipped a step somewhere, like childhood is a room they walked through too quickly to actually furnish with memories. They can recall facts about being young. They struggle to recall the feeling of being young, the specific unguarded lightness of a mind that has nothing urgent to manage. This is why certain rooms still do something strange to your body even now. A tense dinner table, a raised voice 2 rooms away, a silence that lasts 1 second too long. Your body was there before your mind can even name what is happening. It remembers the room. It remembers what growing up fast felt like, and it is still bracing for the next time it will be needed. Why your friends feel like children to you. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people your own age and feeling like the only adult at a birthday party. You laugh at the right moments. You participate. But some quiet part of you is standing slightly outside the group, watching everyone react to small things as though they were large things, and wondering when you lost the ability to do the same. This is not arrogance, even though it can feel uncomfortably close to it, and even though you may have privately worried that it is. It is a mismatch in emotional processing speed. While your peers were allowed to have age-appropriate crises over things like a canceled plan or a minor social slight, you were, at a similar age, managing things that required an adult's nervous system. The result is a strange asynchrony. Chronologically, you are the same age as everyone around you. Emotionally, you are operating with the pattern recognition of someone who has already lived through the kind of chaos your peers have not yet encountered, and may never encounter in the same way. You did not choose to outgrow your peers. Growth was demanded of you before it was offered to them. This mismatch shows up in small, deniable moments that are easy to dismiss individually and impossible to ignore once you notice the pattern. A friend spirals for days over a minor disagreement that you would have resolved and released within an hour. Not because you feel less, but because your threshold for what counts as an actual emergency was calibrated by something far larger than a disagreement. A group of peers plans an entire evening around a decision you would have made in 90 seconds as a child, simply because you never had the luxury of deliberating. You watch them enjoy the deliberation itself, the drama of it, the safety of a problem that is allowed to take up space without real consequences. And something in you feels almost nostalgic for a version of stress you were never permitted to have. There is also a subtler cost here, one that rarely gets named. When you consistently function above the emotional register of your peer group, people start relying on you the way they would rely on someone genuinely older. You become the friend who gives advice more than the friend who receives it, the one who de-escalates more than the one who gets soothed. Over time, this can quietly reinforce the very isolation it was meant to solve, because a role built around being the calm, capable one leaves very little room for anyone to ask how you are doing, and even less room for you to answer honestly if they did. This creates a specific and painful kind of isolation, because it is largely invisible. Nobody can see emotional age the way they can see height. From the outside, you look exactly like everyone else your age. From the inside, you are fluent in a language of coping and vigilance that most of the room has never had to learn, and that fluency, ironically, is what keeps you from feeling like you belong anywhere fully. The hypervigilance that aged you. To understand why you feel older, we have to talk about what was actually happening inside your body during those early years, not just what was happening around you, because the aging we are describing is not philosophical, it is neurological. When a child grows up in an environment that requires constant monitoring, whether that is a volatile parent, an unpredictable household, or simply an absence of steady emotional support, the nervous system adapts by staying switched on. This is called hypervigilance, and it is not a personality trait. It is a survival setting. Your brain learned to scan rooms for danger before it learned to enjoy them. It learned to read tone of voice, posture, and silence with the precision of a translator, because getting the read wrong could mean real consequences. That scanning takes energy, enormous, continuous, invisible energy. A nervous system that is always slightly braced does not get to spend its resources on the things childhood is supposed to be for: play, boredom, wonder, the slow, unstructured accumulation of a personality that isn't defined by threat. Instead, that energy goes toward keeping everyone, including yourself, safe. Over years, this constant readiness produces something that looks a great deal like maturity from the outside: careful speech, measured reactions, an unusual ability to stay calm while others panic. People call this wisdom. Often it is something closer to exhaustion that has learned to wear a composed face. You were not born wise beyond your years. You were trained by circumstance to never fully relax, and stillness became the only performance no one ever questioned. There is a physiological detail worth sitting with. The autonomic nervous system operates on a spectrum, from full alarm to full rest, with a wide middle ground where most of ordinary life is supposed to happen. Children raised in unpredictable environments often never get to explore that middle ground, because their systems learn correctly for the time that dropping the guard even slightly could mean missing an important cue. So instead of oscillating naturally between alertness and ease, the system settles into a narrower band that stays permanently closer to alert. This is not something you can think your way out of, because it was never installed through thinking. It was installed through repetition, and it will only shift through a different kind of repetition, one built on actual felt safety, rather than understanding alone. This also explains a detail many people in this position notice but rarely connect to its source. Compliments about your calmness under pressure can feel oddly hollow, even irritating, Because what looks like calmness from the outside can feel, from the inside, like a version of holding your breath that has simply lasted so long it no longer feels like holding your breath at all. This is a crucial distinction, because it changes the entire way you should be relating to your own maturity. It was never a gift, it was a cost. And costs, unlike gifts, can eventually be renegotiated. The grief no one let you have. Here is something that rarely gets said out loud, because it sounds almost absurd until you actually sit with it. You are allowed to grieve a childhood you technically had, even if no one hit you, even if the refrigerator was always full, even if photographs from that time look completely ordinary. You can still be mourning something real. The emotional experience of being young that circumstances quietly took from you. Grief usually requires a clear loss, a death, a breakup, a diagnosis. But the loss of an age-appropriate childhood is diffuse. It did not happen in a single moment. It happened in 10,000 small moments where you chose competence over comfort, where you managed a feeling instead of simply having it, where you noticed an adult needed you to be fine and so you became fine, on command, over and over, until fine stopped being a feeling and became a costume. Because this loss has no funeral, most people who experienced it never grieve it properly. Instead, the grief gets rerouted into other things, into overachievement, into a compulsive need to be useful, into a strange, persistent sadness on birthdays that you can never quite explain to anyone, including yourself. You are not being dramatic if you feel sad about a childhood that looked fine on the outside. You are recognizing something true, that being fine and being nurtured are not the same experience, and only one of them actually leaves a child intact. This grief is especially hard to access because it lacks a villain in the way most grief narratives require. Perhaps your parents loved you deeply and were simply overwhelmed. Perhaps nobody in your household did anything a courtroom would recognize as wrong. This absence of a clear culprit often leads people to conclude they have no right to grieve at all, that naming the loss would be an act of ingratitude toward people who, in most other ways, tried their best. But grief is not a verdict about anyone's character. It is simply an honest accounting of what happened to you, separate from anyone's intentions. You can hold both truths at once. Your caregivers may have done their best with what they had, and you may still have lost something real in the process, something worth acknowledging rather than minimizing for the sake of everyone else's comfort. There is also a particular ache that surfaces around milestones, the ones that are supposed to feel purely celebratory, a birthday that quietly reminds you of how little celebration your younger self ever received, a holiday that recreates, almost against your will, the same tension you spent years learning to manage. These moments are not random. They are your nervous system recognizing an anniversary your conscious mind never marked on a calendar. Letting yourself grieve this, even briefly, even privately, is not indulgent. It is one of the only ways the body ever gets to complete a process it was never given permission to finish. Old souls and the myth of being chosen. There is a phrase people love to give you, usually as a compliment. Old soul. It sounds beautiful. It sounds spiritual. Almost enviable, as though you were handed a rare gift at birth, some ancient wisdom that skipped a few lifetimes and landed early in yours. But look closer at that phrase, and a quieter truth appears underneath it. Calling something an old soul is often a gentle, socially acceptable way of describing a child who had to stop being a child too early, without anyone having to say the harder sentence out loud. It reframes an adaptation to hardship as a mystical trait, which feels much better to say at a family dinner than the truth. This person grew up around too much responsibility, too young. This is not to say there is nothing real in the phrase. People who matured early often do carry a genuine depth, a capacity for empathy and pattern recognition that took real cost to build. That part is not a myth. What is a myth is the idea that this depth arrived as a blessing, untethered from any wound. Depth built from hardship is still depth, but it is worth knowing where yours came from instead of mistaking the scar tissue for a birthright. You were not chosen for wisdom. You were exposed to more than a child should carry, and wisdom is simply what your mind built out of the wreckage because building was the only option available. There is a reason this particular myth is so seductive, and it is worth naming honestly. Believing you were born an old soul is, in a strange way, less painful than believing you were made into one. The first story requires nothing from anyone. It is simply your nature, cosmic and unquestionable. The second story requires acknowledging that your environment asked something of you it had no right to ask, which in turn requires feeling something about that fact, which many people who had to grow up fast have spent years avoiding, because feeling was never a luxury they were given room for in the first place. Letting go of the old soul explanation is not about rejecting your depth. It is about relocating its origin story from the mystical to the human, which is actually the more respectful version of the truth. A person who survives difficult conditions and emerges with genuine insight has done something remarkable, not because the universe selected them, but because they did the work, mostly alone, mostly unrecognized, of turning a hard set of circumstances into something usable. That is not magic. That is resilience. And resilience deserves to be seen clearly, without the soft-focused spiritual filter that quietly erases everything it took to get there. Understanding this does not diminish what you carry. If anything, it makes it more impressive, because it means your depth was earned inside conditions that could have easily produced something far more broken instead. And that earned depth quietly shapes something else, the kind of people you have been drawn to your entire life. Why you're drawn to people older than you. If you trace back your closest relationships, you may notice a pattern that felt like coincidence for a long time, but was never really coincidence at all. You gravitate toward people older than you, sometimes significantly so. Mentors, partners, friends who are 10, 15, 20 years ahead of you on the timeline. And people your own age often feel, without either of you quite saying it, slightly too young to fully understand you. This is not about maturity as a status symbol. It is about resonance. Someone who has lived longer has typically metabolized more of the things you were forced to metabolize early. Loss, responsibility, disappointment, the slow erosion of certain illusions about how fair life is supposed to be. When you sit across from an older person who has processed those things, something in you exhales, because for the first time in a while, you are not the most emotionally load-bearing person in the room. There is also a quieter, sadder layer underneath this pattern. Some part of you may be searching without fully realizing it for the steady adult presence that was missing during the years you needed it most. Not because you are broken, but because that need never fully closes on its own. It waits patiently for someone who finally feels safe enough to receive it. You are not chasing older people because you are shallow or strange. You are searching for the specific gravity of someone who has already survived what shaped you, because their presence tells your nervous system it is finally allowed to rest. This pattern can also show up in less obvious places than romantic or platonic preference. It can appear as a fascination with history, philosophy, or the lives of people from earlier generations, a sense of kinship with eras you never lived through. It can appear as discomfort with small talk and a hunger for conversations that go somewhere real within minutes, because you learned early that time spent on the surface of things was time you often did not have. It can even appear as a subtle impatience with people your own age who are still discovering things you had to learn under pressure, not because you look down on them, but because watching someone leisurely arrive at a lesson that cost you something can be quietly disorienting. None of this means peer relationships are closed off to you forever, or that something is wrong with wanting them. It means that when you do find peers who feel like an exception to this pattern, people your own age who somehow carry a similar depth, the relief can be enormous, almost disproportionate to what a normal friendship would produce. That disproportion is information. It tells you how rare it has been to feel fully met by someone standing at the same point on the timeline as you. Recognizing this pattern does not mean you need to abandon it. It means you get to choose it consciously now, instead of being pulled by it unconsciously. The loneliness of being the strong one. There is a specific role that people who mature too early tend to occupy in every group they belong to. The strong one. The one who holds things together. The one everyone calls at 2 a.m, and who nobody thinks to call in return, because you have made competence look so effortless that people forget it costs you anything at all. This role comes with a hidden clause that almost nobody names directly. If you are always the strong one, You rarely get permission to be the one who is struggling. Not because people would refuse you that permission if you asked. Often, they would gladly give it, but because you have spent so many years building an identity around being the reliable one, that asking for help feels less like vulnerability and more like a kind of identity collapse. So instead, you carry things alone that were never meant to be carried alone. You solve your own crises quietly, efficiently, the way you learned to as a child, and you tell yourself this is simply who you are, rather than recognizing it as a strategy you built out of necessity that has since calcified into a personality. Being the strong one is not a flaw. It becomes a prison only when it forgets it is allowed to have exceptions. There is a specific moment many people in this position eventually reach, and it is worth naming, because it can feel disorienting when it happens. It is the moment you realize you have gotten so good at appearing fine that people around you have stopped checking, not out of neglect but out of trust, because you built a track record so consistent that concern for you simply stopped occurring to them as necessary. This is one of the cruelest ironies of being the strong one. The better you are at it, the less support you tend to receive, because your competence quietly signals to everyone around you that support is not required here. Breaking this pattern rarely happens through a dramatic announcement. It tends to happen in small, almost invisible moments, saying, "I'm actually not okay today," instead of performing the usual fine, letting a silence sit instead of filling it with reassurance for someone else, allowing a single visible crack to exist without immediately explaining it away. These moments feel enormous internally and often go completely unnoticed externally, which can be its own strange disappointment. But they matter anyway, because each one is a small piece of evidence offered to your own nervous system that being seen as less than perfectly capable does not actually produce the catastrophe it once might have. The loneliness here is a particular flavor, distinct from ordinary isolation. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people who love you and still feeling like none of them know the version of you that gets tired. That version exists. It has always existed. It has simply never been given a stage. And even though your mind has learned to live with that arrangement, your body never agreed to it. What your body remembers. Even when your mind forgets, the mind is remarkably good at rewriting a story to make it survivable. It can tell you a chaotic childhood was fine, that you turned out okay, that there is nothing to unpack because look, you function, you succeed, you show up. The mind can be convinced of almost anything, given enough time and enough motivation to protect itself from an uncomfortable truth. The body is far harder to convince. This is why you might find yourself inexplicably drained after ordinary social situations that seem to cost other people nothing. Why certain tones of voice make your shoulders rise toward your ears before you consciously register why. Why rest itself can feel unfamiliar, even threatening, as though your body does not fully trust an environment with nothing urgent happening in it. These are not personality quirks. They are somatic memory. Your body kept a record of what it took to survive your early years, even in the moments your mind has since smoothed over into a tidy, forgivable narrative. This is important, because it means healing cannot happen only in the mind. You can understand every psychological mechanism in this video intellectually, and still find your shoulders tightening in the exact same rooms. The nervous system does not update on logic alone. It updates on repeated, felt experiences of actual safety, over time, in the body, not just in the story you tell about your life. Your body was the one doing the surviving. It deserves to be part of the healing too, not just the mind that narrates it afterward. This is also why purely intellectual insight, the kind this video is offering you right now, has real value but real limits. You can watch a video like this one, nod along, recognize every pattern, and still find that nothing fundamentally shifts, because insight lives in a different part of the nervous system than the one that learned to brace. What actually moves the needle tends to be smaller and slower than a realization, a body that gets to practice again and again, being in a room where nothing bad happens, a relationship that proves, through hundreds of ordinary repetitions rather than one grand gesture, that it will not disappear the moment you stop being useful. A single afternoon where you notice, almost by accident, that your shoulders have dropped and your jaw has unclenched and you did not have to force either one. None of this happens on command, and it rarely happens quickly, which can be frustrating for someone who learned early to solve problems efficiently. But the nervous system does not respond well to efficiency demands. It responds to safety, offered patiently, over time, until it finally believes the offer is real, learning to meet your age. Again, if everything so far has felt heavy, here is where the weight starts to shift. Because understanding why you grew up too fast is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a genuinely available second one. Meeting your age again does not mean becoming reckless or forgetting everything your maturity has taught you. It means slowly, deliberately, giving yourself permission to experience some of what got skipped. That might look like doing something purely for enjoyment with no productive purpose attached to it, without the old reflex to justify why you deserve the time. It might look like letting someone else hold a problem for once, even a small one, and noticing that the world does not end when you are not the one solving it. It might look like sitting with boredom instead of immediately filling it, because boredom was often unsafe for you as a child, a space where vigilance had nowhere useful to go, and learning that boredom can simply be boredom now is its own small revolution. This process is slow, and it will not feel natural at first, because you are asking a nervous system that was built for constant readiness to gradually give up a post it has held for decades. But nervous systems are not fixed. They are adaptive by design, which means the very quality that let you grow up too fast is the same quality that can, eventually, let you grow back into the parts of yourself that were postponed. You do not have to earn the right to be young in the ways you missed. You already earned it a long time ago, in a room where nobody else was paying the bill. There is often resistance to this process, and it is worth naming so you do not mistake it for failure when it shows up. Rest can feel like laziness. Play can feel like a waste of time you should be spending productively. Letting someone else carry a problem can feel like abandoning your post. These reactions are not character flaws. They are the old operating system defending itself, because for a long time that system's entire purpose was to keep you safe by staying busy, useful, and alert. Asking it to stand down is not a small request, even when your adult mind fully understands why the request is reasonable. A useful reframe here is to treat this process the way you would treat physical rehabilitation after an old injury. You would not expect a muscle that has been braced for 20 years to relax the first time someone tells it to. You would expect small, repeated patient exercises, some of which fail, most of which feel strange before they feel natural. The same applies here. Meeting your age again is not a single decision. It is a practice, revisited in small doses, for as long as it takes the newer, calmer evidence to outweigh the old. The peace that comes from growing sideways, not just up. We tend to imagine growth as a straight line moving upward and forward, each year adding neatly onto the last. But some of the most important growth you will ever do moves sideways instead. It goes back into years you already lived through once at the wrong speed, and lives them again, more slowly, with more permission, in the body of the adult you have since become. This is not about becoming someone new. It is about integration. The child who had to grow up too fast is not a separate, broken version of you living somewhere in the past. She, or he, is still here, underneath the competence and the composure, waiting to be acknowledged, rather than managed. And the strange, quiet gift of adulthood is that you finally have the resources that child never had, the ability to choose your environment, the ability to say no, the ability to build a life with enough safety in it that vigilance is no longer the only available setting. There is something worth saying plainly here because it rarely gets said. You are allowed to keep the parts of your maturity that genuinely serve you, the steadiness, the empathy, the ability to hold complexity without panicking. None of that has to be dismantled in the name of healing. What gets to change is not the depth itself, but the compulsion underneath it, the sense that you must always be the capable one, the calm one, the one who does not need. You can keep the wisdom and release the exhaustion. They were never actually the same thing. even though circumstance forced them to grow tangled together for a very long time. Feeling older than everyone your age was never a flaw in your character. It was a record of everything you carried before anyone should have asked you to carry it. And the fact that you are still here, still noticing, still asking why, is proof that whatever you built out of that early weight was strong enough to hold. You do not have to keep aging faster than the years require. You are allowed finally to grow at your own pace, in whatever direction feels most like coming home. That is the real meaning behind feeling older than your years. Not a curse and not a mystical gift either. Simply a very human response to circumstances that ask too much, too soon, from someone who deserved the ordinary, unremarkable privilege of just being young.